Compassionate advocacy. That is the topic of the Autism Outreach podcast today. I had an amazing conversation with Dr. Annie McLaughlin. She is a board certified behavior analyst and an IEP advocate. When I came across her information on Instagram, you know how I love social media, I was really, really impressed. That's not a duo that you see that often, somebody who understands applied behavior analysis and somebody who is helping as an IEP advocate. She graduated from the University of Virginia and she began her career as a special education teacher before attending the University of Washington for her doctorate and BCBA-D. She worked in a clinic and home setting as a behavior analyst when she lived in Virginia, and currently she helps families navigate the special education and 504 process and also consults with school districts across the country for students with complex learning and behavior needs. She also teaches behavior analysts and related service providers to add IEP advocacy to their work. I took a course through Wright's Law all about the IEP process. It was very, very interesting. I got this really great book, actually, I think 2 books, all about being kind of an advocate in the role I serve students in as a speech therapist and BCBA. And I especially felt like more of an advocate for families when I was seeing children in their home. And usually those children were younger and they were navigating the IEP process for the first time and navigating non-public programs and public school districts. So all of us are advocates on some level. I hope that you love this episode. And if you do, make sure that you like the podcast and subscribe on Apple Podcasts and leave me a review. Do you love this topic? Is it helpful? Are there other things that you want to hear about? Let me know, and let's dig on in to this episode.
You're listening to Autism Outreach Podcast, a podcast full of ready-to-use strategies to help those with autism strengthen their communication skills. Here's your host, Rose Griffin of ABA Speech, a speech therapist and board-certified behavior analyst who shares tips you can use in your next therapy session.
Welcome to the Autism Outreach Podcast. We have a great conversation today. Welcome with us, Dr. Annie McLaughlin. Nice to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I am excited to talk with you about all the amazing work that you're doing. And I think that we connected at first over on Instagram. I talk about social media a lot here because it's a big part of my life, Annie. I'm not going to lie. It's a big part of my life. So I taped another episode today and the person was from LinkedIn. That's where we had connected. It was also actually a PhD level BCBA-D, Brianne Hartley. I don't know if you know who that is, but she's doing really great work. And she's in Indianapolis. So thanks so much for coming on. I'm excited just to hear about all the great work that you're doing and kind of what you're doing in the online space too. So tell us a little bit about you and your journey into the field, how you got into applied behavior analysis and kind of what you're up to now.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I started out as a special education teacher. So I was, say boots on the ground that way, a couple different boots on the ground stories, but started as a special ed teacher at from the University of Virginia and taught in Virginia. And I didn't know at the time, but I was learning ABA, right, all through my master's courses. And then as I was teaching, I was in an ABA enhanced classroom, which at the time, that was all I knew as a teacher. So I had a couple extra trainings, but I really just at that point learned that, good teaching follows the behavior of science. And I would say I fell in love with learning more and really wanting to learn more about teaching and about, how to help kids specifically with communication needs. I was actually borderline almost a speech pathologist. I keep thinking maybe if I go back to school, I would be a speech pathologist. But actually I was teaching in Washington State. We moved, my husband was in the Navy, so I was out in Washington State. On a very small island, Whidbey Island. Anybody who's heard of it, you should go or haven't heard
I was
of
it. I was gonna say where in Washington State. Funny enough, I'm actually licensed in Washington State. This actually came from an Instagram DM. Somebody that has 5 clinics up there a couple years ago reached out to me, and they have this really neat program. I don't know if they had it when you were there, but the kids, if they qualify, get 12 weeks of ABA and 12 weeks of speech therapy. And it's very, very hard for clinics to find a speech therapist because it's based on the referrals, and it could be a clinic could have one kid, a clinic could have 3 kids at a time, and then they go through this 12-week program and then they get new kids, but it's all based on the referrals that they're getting. So it's really hard for them to have a speech therapist in person because it could be like a half hour a week for 12 weeks. Then it could be 2 hours a week. And so for the past 4 years, now we're supporting 5 clinics in the Washington state. So I do know some Tacoma, Wenatchee. Like I do know a lot of the different places up there. I haven't been there, but the National Speech Therapy Conference is in Seattle next year. So I'm making my way up there. Yeah.
A short hop about 2 hours north of there is an island called Whidbey, which is lovely. It's where we lived when I was teaching. Yeah. And we had a consultant who was a professor at the University of Washington and just kind of through conversation decided to go back and get my doctorate from there, as well as my BCBA. So I was working with Carol Davis and Eileen Schwartz around inclusion and behavior analysis and communication. And so through all of that, I worked on implementing in schools. And so I was able to support a grant on tier 3 behavior supports in schools, which I loved because I could be in the classroom and helping teams kind of navigate that. And that really then sparked my interest in schools and kind of connecting. Because at the time, there were not a lot of behavior analysts in schools. And so having gotten a PhD in special education and behavior analysis, I was really excited to kind of merge those two. I started in IEP advocacy kind of by accident. Just people would call me and be like, can you help me understand this paperwork? Or can you come, do a consultation to my school? And which I, again, loved, but they were kind of more short term, right? Like help me around this one specific, like small challenge. And then my husband told me he wanted to quit his job. So which is what brought us to Baltimore. And so I was like, well, I guess I should probably try to look for something more full time. At that point, we had a daughter. And it just kind of naturally, well, if I like this job, I like what I'm doing. Let me just tell all the people who I was working with that I'm, looking for more clients to be able to do IEP advocacy. So most of the full-time work that I have 2 full-time employees who are behavior analysts, and we do school consultation and IEP advocacy here in Maryland and some across. It depends what you're asking for, kind of around the United States. We can look at some IEPs, but we're not going to be a behavior analyst in another state that we're not licensed in. So it just depends on what we need. We're mostly focused in Maryland.
Yes. No, I know what you're saying. I get calls from all over the world. It's a slippery slope. So I love that idea of being a BCBA and advocate. It's really a good combination. Have you found that your training as a BCBA has been helpful in your advocacy work? Did you work? Well, let me step back. Have you worked so you consulted as a BCBA through your coursework and training, and then did you spend time also in a clinical position where you were consulting in the schools? Or I guess, what is your relationship with the public schools, your background?
Sure. So I actually was a BCBA in a clinic. So I did clinic work as well as home work, as well as then also school consultation as a BCBA. But that was also like contractor. So I have not been an employed BCBA by a school district. We did help a school district realize how wonderful BCBAs could be to support them, and they've hired since then. But so most of my work has been on like a consulting basis, but kind of not recently, 12 years ago or so, we kind of got into the long-term consulting. So more kind of ongoing program support and, support with behavior intervention plans and things like that.
That's nice. And I do feel like when you were saying, I've been a speech therapist 20 years and dually certified 12. And I just did a podcast episode with Dr. Bruce Tinner. And we talked about BCBAs in the schools, because how it was, and maybe when you started too, how it traditionally was, is there would be a public school and maybe an outside consultant would come into the school. And then sometimes there's that dynamic of, oh dear, things are not going well. Now let's call the BCBA, right? But what I have seen too, and even in my little hometown here on the east side of Cleveland, is they have is a very small kind of rural district, comparatively speaking, and they have their own BCBA on staff as a district employee. And we are seeing that over and over and over again. And I think that that is kind of nice because I mean, that person definitely has a lot on their plate, right? So there's definitely and that person still consults with outside consultants, because I think that's what's hard about the public school is it's like, it's the public. It's a free appropriate education. This is your LRE. It's like selective mutism. Yeah, we can help with that. Stuttering, sure. This kid who's destroying the classroom and eloping into the street, yep, we can do that too. And it goes in back to our kind of our competency of like, yeah, but I don't, what is our scope of practice? What is our competency? Because we can't know everything and we can't do everything. But that's what's hard about being a public school employee, is that you're tasked with knowing everything and doing everything. So having somebody to talk with, and then vice versa, making sure that parents feel comfortable as well with the advocacy piece. So tell me how you are how do you traditionally support parents through the IEP process? And I know that you mentioned that you use ACT to support families, which we've been talking about, acceptance and commitment therapy. It is not something I use a lot in my practice, like with students, but I do like to talk about ACT. And I've had Kate Nasudi on, Cody Harms. We talk about ACT a lot. I think ACT has more applications for me right now, just kind of in my own personal life, as far as like, what are your values? And like, does this job meet that? And, I like to talk about ACT in that way. So tell me how you're kind of using that to support your families, because I do find it extremely interesting.
Yeah, so I am definitely using, I would say similarly to you, right? That ACT as a lens, right? You're kind of listening and talking to people and, figuring out kind of how their language might put them in a different process, right? Like, are they really, really firmly fused with a belief about what's happening, right? Or is there a level of a lot of talk and no committed action. So I think when I also came to ACT through an ACT boot camp that was in Baltimore, which was lovely and life-changing. So I have no affiliation with any of the boot camps, but it was definitely one of those things I was piqued my interest. And then when I went, I was full in, received some additional classes and then supervision. So I do, but I don't say I like use ACT, right?
Yeah.
I kind of infuse those processes into the discussions. But what I've found really is that it's particularly the lens of working in collaboration with schools and families and trying to help families identify their priorities, because they usually come to us with huge concerns, right? Something has usually happened and it's usually not good, whatever it is. And so people show up quite heated. And so through those discussions, I'm really trying to either help them or kind of listen carefully to identify what their values are, specifically around, school, their family. Typically people are calling us kind of really wanting to talk about inclusion or questions about progress, behaviors that interfere with learning, and communicate. So communication, both for the individual, but then communication between, school and home. And so then just trying to really ask some clarifying questions around, is this where we're going to kind of put our priorities for the advocacy piece? So it really is, kind of using that lens to help identify how I can be the most supportive in making sure their voice is heard within the IEP process.
Okay. So then as an advocate, because having worked in a public school, I have worked with advocates and I have worked privately as well too. So I have an interesting perspective because I worked in the non-public programs and done the IEs, and I've also been a public school speech therapist and worked with advocates, some friendly and some not so warm and fuzzy. What type of advocacy services are you providing? So are you providing things where you're kind of talking with families? And I love that idea of trying to see what their their main priority is. Because I think sometimes when you're upset, I am a parent too of 3 kids, typical developing, but there's always something going on. Except for this, I have a son, so I'm always at school about something. But people, you're so worked up, right? It's your kids, and maybe you feel like they're not doing enough, or maybe there's a miscommunication, or some of the parents that I've worked with feel like they don't understand the special education process. They don't understand the IEP process. They're not, they feel nervous about asking, can I do this? And what are my rights? And all those types of things. I do think that when advocates are present at IEP meetings, that it can either go well, it can be really collaborative. I've had those experiences where maybe I'm working with a student and it's really just, it's a true advocate where it's like an advocate for the family to help explain things, working with other specialists and kind of like being the conductor of the orchestra where there's a student with complex needs and there's just so many people involved, right? And that advocate is one really important piece to the puzzle. So are you doing advocate work where it's behind the scenes and you're attending meetings and going on school property, or how does that look? Because you know how it can be contentious, and I think it's really hard. We have to use all of our inner strength to be in those kind of critical conversations where sometimes somebody dropped the ball and maybe somebody could be doing something better, and trying to talk about that in a diplomatic way. It's hard.
Sure. It is really hard. And, I think first and foremost, I tell people this in our initial consultation actually is I show up as a human with compassion first, right? So I think almost everybody at the table is there because they're there for kids, right? They want the kids to learn and do better, and they're in education. So, I show up with compassion and as a human, and I will also hold the feet to the fire. So if somebody dropped the ball, there's got to be a reason, right? So maybe they didn't know to do it. So like sometimes those underlying pieces, but collaboration is key. A few years ago, right before COVID, I was walking into a meeting and somebody grabs my hand, and usually people, they're not friends. So they're like, right, grabbed my hand. I was like, oh, and she just said, I'm so glad you're here. And to me, I was like, okay, and then afterwards I kind of pulled her aside and I was curious about that. She said, there's just been so much miscommunication on both the school and the family's part that if we can help get everybody on the same page, I actually think things are going quite well. I think the family will be happy. I think the school will be happy. And if we just needed to get there. So I really prioritize that open communication and active listening. I really, really, really actually, part of the social media stuff that I have done is to promote a course that I have created called Pivot into IEP Advocacy, because BCBAs and related service providers were actually coming to me and say, how can I be an advocate? So as I was training my 2 staff and realized, oh, I do love advocacy and I want to help other people get into that, is wanting to be the advocate, or you want to be the advocate that everybody wants to show up. And so that we can make sure. So when we go to meetings, the parents know what to expect. We've gone over the acronyms, kind of, if you have a concern, where does that concern come up in the process? And really, truly trying to make sure that I recognize and validate all of the expertise at the table, right? I'm not a speech pathologist, and I don't come to the table as the same as the school-based BCBA who might see the kid 5 days a week. I might have other ideas. We can talk about it. So one, really to make sure that we start in a collaborative, everybody has their expertise, shared decision-making, so that, those diverse perspectives can all really be at the table. Because we don't know everything, right? I mean, there are even times, you said you have 3 kids. I also have 3 kids and have been at the 504 table and at the IFSP table. And I bring somebody with me and people they're like, does that mean I just get so emotional,
Yeah.
And so I think really just the idea that somebody's there to, take some extra notes, or if you do get lost in your emotions, that there's somebody there to kind of be like, hold on, let's make sure this is addressed. So, where we're a little bit different than I think a lot of advocates is that BCBA background. So one of my favorite things is to do classroom observations. I still get to see really great instruction, right? So I get to see really cool things. I mean, there's times I'm like, can I take a picture of that lovely,
Right. Yeah.
visual because I'm really inspired by it.
Right.
It's nothing to do with my client that I'm in here for, and there's no names on it, so I can take a picture.
HIPAA.
But really having that lens, that behavior analytic lens for kind of helping, kind of some of the nuances for kids with complex needs in particular.
Oh, that's great. No, I think it's a really nice background because obviously you're able to be a source of support to not only the team, and I like the idea of being collaborative because I have had we've done a couple conversations with people who are advocates, and I think that it can be really a great position. I actually took the 1 year I stepped away from my school-based job and I just did ABA speech. But I realized I cannot work from home every day. I was very lonely. So now I'm back 2 days a week in my local school district. But during that time, I was just feeling like I was doing a lot of advocacy work for my private clients that I would see in their home because they had preschool age students or kids that were just identified as being autistic. And so I took the rights law course just to learn about all of that. And I joined COPA, actually, pretty good discussion boards. And she's not as big on social media anymore, but now it's Dr. Robin Rissigno. She's actually on the East Coast. She's in New York. She was really big on TikTok. She is an autistic female, actually started out as a special education teacher, but she does a lot of advocacy work. And so we talked about that too. And because it can be really a great thing for parents and for staff to work with somebody who is collaborative, who can kind of be there to help both sides. And that's nice. I mean, I have said too before, even though I'm a speech therapist and a BCBA, I think it's nice to consult with outside speech therapists and outside BCBAs because sometimes parents will look to the outside consultant for that recommendation. Even if it's something that the school team already said, sometimes it just reinforces what's already been said. So I think sometimes it can be nice to have that consultant dynamic. So I think it sounds great, the work that you're doing. So tell us a little bit about your business. What is your Instagram handle? I know I'm following you on Instagram now, but
it's IEP Advocate Annie.
Okay, wonderful. So your course is geared towards helping professionals become advocates or getting into advocacy work?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Exactly. Many people, have, I think similar to you, right? Either are feeling like they're attending a lot of IEP meetings and want some more background in special ed, or I could take that next step really to be more of an advocate. And I'll tell you, I didn't call myself an advocate for probably a good 5 or 6 years because some people just associate that kind of negative feeling or vibe to it. But I feel like that's what parents were looking for. And so I wanted to make sure that I was clear kind of on my role for the parents.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. I think that's really great. And I think the thing too to talk about is that almost like anybody can call themselves kind of behavior specialist, anybody can really say they're an advocate, right? There's no place where we're both BCBAs, you're a PhD, I'm a speech therapist. To get those things, there's a lot of hard work and licensure and tests. And we went through a lot to get all that stuff. But for advocates, anybody can say they're an advocate, right? So it sounds like your class is really kind of giving people a framework and the knowledge kind of going forward of what does that really mean to be an advocate?
Correct. Exactly. Yes. And then the business pieces behind it as well.
Oh, that's exciting. That's always helpful for people because I think that's hard. People have an idea and then it's hard to get it all into fruition. Amazing. Well, it sounds like you're doing such great work. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. And I will make sure to share this on our Instagram and make sure we will put your handle down in our show notes and a link for your course as well.
Great. That sounds awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Autism Outreach. If you enjoyed the show today, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode full of actionable strategies you can use in your therapy room. Write a review too. That would mean so much to me. I always love hearing from you. Have a specific topic that you want included on a future show? Reach out over on Instagram, ABA Speech by Rose, or visit me at www.abaspeech.org.